Hey there, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. You wanted the inside scoop on how the OECD's tax proposals, specifically Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, could actually affect businesses, especially one like yours. So we rolled up our sleeves and dug into that OECD research you shared to bring you some insightful answers.
And we're going beyond those dense reports to uncover what's really interesting, how these proposed changes might actually play out in the real world.
Exactly. We're not just talking theory here. We're going to use this cool concept called effective tax rates to see what the actual tax burden could look like.
It's like looking beyond the sticker price of a car. You need to factor in all those extras to understand the real cost effects. Effective tax rates, or ETRs as we call them in the biz, do that for us. They give us a clearer picture than just looking at a country's corporate tax rate on paper.
So it's about cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of the matter, right?
ETRs show us the percentage of profit a business actually ends up paying in taxes on an investment, taking into account all those deductions, allowances, and even some, shall we say, strategic maneuvers companies might make.
Yeah, that brings us to this idea of profit shifting, which I've heard thrown around a lot. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Think of it like this. Imagine a multinational company doing a lot of business in a country with, let's say, a higher corporate tax rate. Now, they also happen to have a headquarters or a subsidiary in a country with a lower tax rate. Profit shifting is when companies totally legally use this kind of setup to strategically report more of their profits in that lower tax country, even if most of their actual business is happening elsewhere.
So it's like finding a way to optimize their tax bill within the rules of the game?
That's a diplomatic way to put it. Now, what's really intriguing about this OECD research is that they actually factor in this profit shifting behavior before even looking at the impact of Pillar 1 and 2. They called this scenario PS, where PS stands for profit shifting.
So they're not pretending businesses operate in some ideal world where everyone pays the maximum amount of tax possible. They're acknowledging the reality on the ground.
Precisely. And that's a key difference from older models that didn't account for this very real aspect of international business. By incorporating scenario PS, this OECD research is taking a much more practical, grounded approach.
So right off the bat, we're talking about a more realistic assessment of the potential impact. This is already making me rethink how I read those OECD reports. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a closer look at Pillar 1 itself. Now, from what I understand, this is all about who gets to tax the profits of those big multinational companies, especially the digital giants. Is that right?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Pillar 1 is attempting to answer it by giving more taxing rights to the countries where the customers are, rather than just where the company happens to have a physical presence.
Okay, so even if a company has, say, no offices or factories in a country, but they're selling a ton online to customers there, that country should get a piece of the tax revenue.
Precisely. They call this creating a new taxing right for market jurisdictions.
So if I'm a country with a large consumer base, but maybe not a lot of multinational headquarters, this could be a game changer.
Potentially. But it's not as simple as just taxing any company that sells something online. Pillar 1 has some specific rules about who actually falls under its scope.
So unpack that for me. How does Pillar 1 actually identify which companies it affects?
Yeah.
Okay, so walk me through this. How does Pillar 1 actually decide which companies get caught in its net?
Well, it's not about casting a wide net. It's more about targeted spearfishing. Pillar 1, specifically what they call Amount A, focuses on companies with global revenues above a certain level. Then within those giants, it zooms in on very specific activities.
So it's not just any company with an online presence. There are thresholds and filters in place.
Absolutely. They're looking at companies making serious bank globally, and then they narrow it down further based on things like automated digital services, think online marketplaces and social media platforms, those kinds of digital heavyweights. They're also looking at consumer-facing businesses, which is a bit broader.
So things like online retailers or streaming services would fall under that consumer-facing umbrella.
You got it.
Yeah.
And to make sure they're being precise, they've also set a profitability threshold. It's about making sure that only the most profitable companies in these specific sectors are the ones being looked at for this reallocation.
It's like a three-pronged approach.
Right.
Revenue, activity, and profitability. They have to tick all the boxes.
Exactly. And that's where all that OECD data on multinational enterprises comes in handy. They're using it to figure out which companies actually fit this very specific profile.
Okay, so let's say a company checks all the boxes. How does Pillar 1 actually work in practice?
Well, once a company qualifies, Pillar 1 then looks at what they call residual profits. Imagine it like this. You have your baseline level of profit, and then anything above that is considered residual, kind of like the cream of the crop pillar. One proposes taking a portion of that residual profit, 20% in their model, and reallocating it to the market countries.
So they're not taking a flat 20% of all profits, just a slice of the profits that are considered above and beyond normal.
You're getting it. And how do they decide which country gets what? That's where it gets really interesting. They use something called an allocation key, which is basically a formula based on sales.
So if I'm a country and a company makes 50% of its global sales within my borders, I'd get a bigger chunk of that reallocated profit than a country where they only make, say, 5% of their sales.
Exactly. It's all about reflecting where the value is actually being generated and consumed. And here's something else to consider. Even with Pillar 1 in place, the OECD model still assumes companies will engage in profit shifting for the profits that aren't subject to this reallocation.
So even with this new system, they're not expecting profit shifting to completely disappear.
It's like trying to redirect a river. You might be able to change its course, but there will always be some water finding its own way around.
Makes sense. Now, we talked about Pillar 1 and this new taxing, right, it creates. What about Pillar 2? It seems like a very different beast.
You could say that if Pillar 1 is about dividing the pie differently, Pillar 2 is about making sure the pie itself is big enough to go around. It acts like a safety net, aiming to ensure that big multinational enterprises are paying a minimum level of tax regardless of where they operate or how they're structured.
So no more playing shell games with subsidiaries in low tax havens.
That's the goal. And the way they're trying to do this is through a mechanism called the Income Inclusion Rule, or IIR.
Okay, break it down for me. How does this IRR actually work?
Imagine the global minimum tax rate is set at 15%, just as an example. Now, let's say a company earns some of its profits in a country with a tax rate of, say, 10%. The IRR would allow the home country of that company to impose an additional 5% tax on those specific profits, bringing them up to that 15% minimum.
So it's like a top-up tax to ensure that no matter where a company earns its money, they're paying at least a baseline amount of tax somewhere.
You got it. It's about preventing companies from escaping taxes altogether by shifting profits to countries with rock-bottom rates. But, and this is where it gets a bit more nuanced, there's some debate about how exactly you calculate that top-up tax. They're considering a couple of different approaches, both involving what they call blending.
Blending,
Hmm.
as in tax smoothie. What kind of blending are we talking about here? Okay, so we're not actually throwing fruit into a blender here. What kind of blending are we talking about when it comes to taxes?
Not quite as delicious, I'm afraid. There are two main options on the table. The first is what they call global blending, where you look at the effective tax rate a company pays on all its foreign profits combined. So you're taking a global average. If that average dips below the minimum boom, the home country can impose a top-up tax to hit that minimum threshold.
So it's like saying, we don't care where you earned it, just show us the global average, and if it's too low, you're topping up.
Exactly. The other option is called jurisdictional blending. This is where they get a bit more granular. Instead of one big calculation, they look at the effective tax rate in each country separately and apply the top-up rule on a case-by-case basis.
So it's more like, okay, let's see. In this country, your rate is fine, but over there, it's below the minimum. Time for a top-up on those profits.
You've got it. Now, there's another layer to this Pillar 2 system. Remember how we talked about incentivizing companies to actually have operations in countries, not just shuffle paper profits around?
Right, make it about real economic activity, not just tax games.
That's where the substance-based carve-out comes into play. This carve-out means that a portion of a company's profits might be excluded from that top-up calculation if they're linked to real tangible things in a country like factories or equipment. The idea is if a company is really investing in a place, a portion of their profits tied to those investments might get a pass on the top-up tax, even if the country's tax rate is low.
So it's like saying, if you're just here for a quick tax break, these rules apply. But if you're really putting down roots and creating jobs, we'll give you some breathing room.
Exactly. And in the OECD model, they specifically look at the tangible asset side of this carve-out. They use a 10% figure in their calculations to estimate how much profit might be shielded.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But after going through all of this, the million-dollar question is, how much will all of this actually change things for businesses? Will it actually make a dent in those effective tax rates we talked about?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The OECD ran the numbers using their model, and you know what they found? While these changes are definitely a big deal on a global scale, they might not radically shift the effective tax rates for a lot of companies.
Really? All this? And we might only see a small blip on the radar. How can that be?
Yeah. Well, remember how Pillar 1 is really targeted towards certain very profitable digital companies, turns out that narrows down the playing field significantly. A lot of companies aren't even touched by it. And even for those that are, it's only a portion of their profits being reallocated. The OECD's own model showed that Pillar 1 only nudged the global average effective tax rate up by a tiny fraction, less than 1/100%.
Wow, that's incredibly small.
Yeah.
It seems like Pillar 1 is more about making a statement and tweaking the rules for a select group, rather than a complete overhaul.
That's a good way to put it. Pillar 2, with its minimum tax, has a bit more bite. The OECD's model found that with jurisdictional blending and a minimum rate set at 12.5%, the global average effective tax rate went up by about a third of a percentage point. Not a huge leap, but definitely more noticeable than Pillar 1.
Okay, so not exactly a corporate tax earthquake, but still some aftershocks.
Precisely. But here's the thing. This is just one model, and it's based on the tax laws as they are now. The really intriguing part is how governments might react to all of this. What if some countries decide to change their tax rules in response to Pillar 1 and 2? What if they try to get more competitive or try to close loopholes that are highlighted by these new
It's
rules?
like a game of chess. One move can set off a whole chain reaction.
Exactly. And that's what makes all of this so fascinating. We have these initial projections, but the real story will unfold over time as the pieces on the global tax chessboard start to move.
That's a perfect note to end on. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer picture what Pillar 1 and 2 are really all about, and more importantly, what they might mean for businesses like yours. Until next time, keep asking those smart questions and keep diving deeper.